forgotten that there are other factors at work that are driving change in the global economy. So the 2 to 5 year time frame is the one that's really important to look at, and it tends to get neglected.
So I'm glad you brought up, there's a lot of change, right, happening, not only here with our election, but with Brexit, now with Italy. There's a lot going on in our political landscape. And I think that makes it harder to think out what's ahead, because there's just a lot of unknown. What's your advice there? What do you think there? How do you advise companies to think in these times of change?
Yeah, I would say don't overreact to all those political changes. I think the idea, if you read the mainstream press, is that with Brexit and with Trump's election, that suddenly we're all going to retreat from the globally integrated economy. Let us not forget that this globally integrated economy has lifted 1 billion people out of the planet, 7 billion people out of poverty over the last 30 years.
Right.
Now, in affluent, more mature economies like Western Europe and the United States, it's been more mixed. It's offered great opportunity for people who understand the trends and are able to mobilize their companies around technology and the other trends, and it's left a lot of legacy companies and legacy thinking in not so good a position. So, but we're not going to back away from global trade. I do believe that instead of mega trade deals, we're probably going to have a lot of bilateral trade agreements. The Trump administration has said a lot of negative things about trade. It's going to find out just how dependent the U.S. economy is on trade. So I think the mistake is to overrate these changes and to underrate the changes that are going on in global population, technology, and everything else.
So kind of don't get so consumed. Pay attention to the entire landscape.
Yeah, have your policy.
It's been hard, right?
Yeah, have your policy people think about it.
About
For sure, there will be changes on the margin and in taxation. In some industries, we'll feel changes in regulation. But for a lot of industries, those will be marginal things, and they won't affect the main event. And the main event is, how do you stay competitive as a company in an era where technology is evolving as fast as it is, when global population and demographic trends are evolving as fast as they are. That's the main event.
So, and let's talk about our main event, which is just that, right? We're talking about these mega trends, and you're known for helping companies to see ahead for us. So what do you think are the mega trends that you're seeing right now that companies should be aware of?
Well, sure. The first one is global population. I think everybody knows we'll have more people by 2050 than we have today. The UN says 9 billion people as opposed to the 7.2 we have today. Others say 9.5. But what's missed in that analysis by a lot of people is that the global population is also becoming richer, older, and more urban. We have approximately 2 billion middle-class people out of 7 billion in the world today. We'll have 3.5 billion to 4 billion. Middle class being defined as you have enough to eat, you have a roof over your head, and you have discretionary income. Middle class of the world isn't what it is in the United States necessarily, but it means discretionary income. We're getting older. We have 600 million people in the world today over 65. We'll have 1.5 billion by 2050. So almost an incremental increase of 1 billion people over 65. Think about what that's going to do to healthcare and everything else. Think about more middle class people, what that's going to do for what people want about food, transportation, travel and entertainment, all the things that people want when they go from poverty to the middle class. And the last one is that the world's population is moving into cities. That if you define urban as a population center of over 500,000, we're going to have a net increase of 2.5 billion people moving from small places to large places between now and 2050. That's bigger than the growth of the overall population. So big city infrastructures, what do the cities of the future look like? These are really, there are trillion-dollar opportunities out there for companies that figure out these demographic trends.
And that's what I was going to ask you. How do you think companies should be taking advantage of that? What should they be thinking about to capitalize on that, as opposed to be a little fearful of it? Like, that's a big changing demographic.
Well, it's appropriate to be fearful, but it's not appropriate to be paralyzed with fear.
Yes, with fear comes opportunity.
The great Andy Grove of Intel, bless his soul, said that only the paranoid survive. And I think that's good. What he meant is a useful amount of paranoia and fear to get you off your butt to think about the future, but then to think about it in an optimistic way. And that's, that's the way to look at it. One of the things that I'm fortunate to do at Forbes is to be able to travel the world. We have big operations in Asia. And so I just came back from our Forbes Global CEO Conference, which this year was in Jakarta, Indonesia. Now think about Indonesia. A lot of Americans don't realize that Indonesia is the 4th biggest populated country in the world, 250 million people. I believe it's number 2 in Facebook population in the world.
Who's number 1? Would it be us?
Number 1 is the U.S. and Facebook.
Okay, I was making sure I had my stats right.
But when you get to instant messaging and WeChat and Tencent, I mean these dwarf anything we have in the United States. But Indonesia is a great example of a country that's moved a lot of people into the middle class. Indonesia has gone from an economy almost completely dependent on oil and gas, which aren't priced so well right now. You would have thought the Indonesia of 10 years ago would have really gone into the dumper, had oil and gas gone into the dumper, which it has. But Indonesia is now much more balanced, consumer-driven economy. Very positive, optimistic people there, as there are in Vietnam and the Philippines, and in countries outside of China, in addition to China.
So there's a lot of good lessons to be learned there. A lot of opportunity. Don't be fearful. Or be a little bit fearful. Be ready. What do you think our second trend is?
Well, the second trend is to really understand the collection of technology trends that are driving change. The first and most obvious one gets talked a lot about is Moore's Law. Now, Moore's Law is specific to semiconductors, but if you think about the general principle of Moore's Law, that things in the digital world tend to get twice as good every 2 years at the same price point.
Yes.
The same price point. And at the same performance point, costs drop about 30% a year. Now that's the one that's not, we see the effects of that. So the effects of it would be that our smartphones are as powerful as our laptops were 10 years ago and so on. But what's really interesting in the world, you don't see it in the United States so much, where we're all happy to buy our Google phones or Apple phones or Samsung. In the poorer parts of the world, the sub-$100 smartphone and the soon-to-be sub-$50 smartphone are game changers. There are estimated population of about 2 billion smartphones in the world, comprising 40% of all mobile phones in the world today. There will be almost 4 billion smartphones just 4 years from now. A net increase of 2 billion smartphones in 4 years. I mean, that's astonishing. It'll come from poorer parts of Asia. India is just at the beginning of a smartphone revolution. Africa, unpenetrated parts of South America. So you think about what the world looks like with 5G wireless and 4 billion smartphones as a web commerce platform, as both consumers of goods and services, but also contributors, to the global economy, now having their first connection ever. It's phenomenal to think about. That leads to Metcalfe's law, the power of connections. N times n minus 1 squared. It's every time you add a node on a network, the number of connections. 4 billion smartphones, or 3.6 billion. I did this off of a calculation of 3.6 billion smartphones will give you 648 followed by 18 zeros, the number of theoretical human connections. Not even, this is not even Internet of Things or machine learning connections. It's simply human connections. So we wonder why things come out of nowhere today, whether good, startups, or trends around the world, or bad, terrorist groups, where people can connect with each other, the power of human connections. The third one would be Bill Joy, who is a co-founder of Sun Microsystems back in the 1980s. Came up with an observation in the early 90s before the commercial web browser came to define the modern web. But he saw it all coming. He saw high bandwidth connections coming. And he said there will come a day, anticipating when you would have 4 billion smartphone users with good connections. And he said, no matter who you are in the world, no matter what company you are, the number of smart people outside of your organization will overwhelm the number of smart people inside of your organization. So if you're an organization, stop thinking about the size of your organization as the size of the people who are on your W-2 payroll, and think about the ecology of your industry and all of these potential contributors, all of these potential cheerleaders or critics, on social media. I mean, they're
it's your extended community,
it's your extended,
right?
and
That's
they
not directly on your payroll,
and they
but it's influencing
overwhelm
your brand.
Yeah, they overwhelm the number of people that you can employ. Even if you're Walmart and employ 2.3 million people. Number 4, Mark Andreessen, who did give us the commercial web browser Netscape in 1995, and now is heads Andreessen Horowitz, a successful venture capital firm, said 2 years ago, software eats everything. Kind of a scary thing to say. You know what he means when you're talking about Uber and you're a cab driver.
Yeah.
But even the U.S. military today, Special Forces, is interviewing retired 4-star General Stanley McChrystal, who led U.S. Special Forces up until his retirement. And he said that the way you organize the Joint Strategic Operations Command, so the Navy SEALs, the Army Rangers, all the cool warriors under that umbrella, is through software. It's integrating, software, data, visual feeds, coordinating operations, much more software driven today. And every business becomes much more software driven today, even traditional industries. And then 5 is not necessarily technology, it's a consequence of the technology, but it's a professor from Columbia named Rita McGrath. And Rita said, because of all these changes and the accelerating evolutionary, pressure they put on all industries, is that sustainable advantage in any industry becomes more perishable. That outsiders can come up and develop a business model, a digital business model that inserts themselves between your customers and start stealing, put a big straw that starts sucking profits out of your industry, reducing you to a commodity supplier. That process will happen more and more swiftly. So if you're an organization today, you have to think about becoming an organization that can seize upon transient advantages, because sustainable advantages will be harder and harder to maintain. Therefore, this highly adaptable kind of an organization is what we all have to become. Even if we have natural sort of quasi-monopolistic, Google has a quasi-monopolistic advantage in search, but it's more perishable than perhaps people know. Just as Microsoft's, monopoly that we thought was a monopoly 15 years ago turned out to be more perishable than we thought, or Walmart's, monopoly of purchasing power in an era of Alibaba and Amazon, is not the moat or the castle wall that it used to be.
And that's also a competitive advantage, I would say, on the flip side, for the smaller businesses who are getting started. We are sort of leveling the playing field with technology, right? Allowing them to compete with these big guys and not pose a threat, but definitely be a competitor and give them a competitive advantage. Wouldn't you say?
Yeah, I think there are. This leads to this idea. It's a theory of mine that if you look at the era of web-driven disruption, not just disruption throughout history, as Clayton Christensen and others have written about so well, but web-era disruption, web business models coming in and disrupting some incumbent business and some incumbent industry. Era number 1, commercial web browser, 1995. For the next 5 or 6 years, the internet bubble. We had a lot of overfunding of companies. Some companies like Amazon broke through and became real keepers. Other companies like Webvan raised over $1 billion on the promise of delivering groceries on a daily basis.